I call Fletcher Tabuto.
I do actually stand in support of this piece of legislation, sir. It is the first reading, and it's definitely a piece of legislation that needs to go through this stage and into the select committee process, because, as noted in the stated objectives within the legislation itself, we do need a higher level of transparency and accountability. But, Mr Speaker, there does seem to be an element of debate, and what I would actually agree with my previous colleague's position about a level of redundancy in regards to the legislation itself in its entirety. As Section 6 of the Act does point out, decisions around these areas can be made already. The scheme has to be fully funded, and it does give account to the fluctuations already in terms of the levy itself. So, sir, I do worry that the bill kind of insinuated earlier that this bill actually kind of gives another level for the minister to come in with this legislation where it's not necessary, and it just adds to the complexity and takes away from that transparency and accountability that we were talking about. However, the stated intent of this bill is to improve the framework for determining how ACC's levies accounts are funded, so it is clearer, more transparent, and has a longer-term focus, and supports more stable levies. And very importantly, to ensure that the residual levy is not over-collected. Now, I stand here on behalf of New Zealand First and say that those goals and those stated aims are to be highly commended. If that is what we're seeking to do with this piece of legislation, sir, then New Zealand First couldn't be more supportive. ACC themselves just recently re-evaluated the liability of the three accounts which they manage. And so we know that the specified amounts defined by the Acts are actually no longer relevant. New Zealand First believes the objectives are on track, like I've just said. This legislation, its stated aim, is doing the right thing. We would insist, though, that the residual levies on the earner's account, the motor vehicle account and the worker account should only be collected until the costs of shifting to the lifetime cost model are absolutely required and obviously no longer. In undertaking this legislative change, ACC and the Minister will be required to be more transparent and consultative in the way the current levy regime is set. New Zealand First suggests that the more the public and those who are involved or affected by the ACC can be involved, the more seamlessly this process will work, sir. But there are several issues to consider, and it's been spoken about tonight already, about putting ACC as a whole in context, a recent history, if you will. The other is to ensure that going forward, this government actually chooses what we would consider to be the right option and not any option to facilitate these changes. The government has a very poor record when it comes to ACC. It has abused the AC system, ignoring good advice, and subsequently has overtaxed New Zealanders by stealth, sir. The average New Zealander, and especially small business, has borne the brunt of this deliberate inaction. Mr Foss, for example, has a small business development group whose purpose is to advise the government on small business issues. But he has not had the ACC conversation with them, and the reality is the burden business has had to bear because of this government's inaction has been huge. Further, he admitted to this House that he hasn't advocated a reduction in levies with this government's cabinet. Broadly speaking, sir, ACC, everyone in this House knows that, including ACC themselves, they've stated unequivocally for some time now, they've been saying that the levies paid by businesses, especially self-employed, need to be reduced. Sir, it has taken far too long. There is no doubt that reducing red tape and improving cash flows are critical issues for small business. The government has sat on this opportunity to help small businesses for far too long. That refusal to budge has been costing businesses thousands a year, individual businesses thousands a year. The frustration out there is palpable. And New Zealand First insists that these changes, not only in terms of the general levy, but the residual levy, sir, are well past due, and our New Zealanders have been paying into ACC at too high a level for far too long. Additionally, this government is well aware that over-collection, especially in the work account, is creating distributional consequences which create constraints on the equity and the incentives for some of our businesses. The government knows that there is no justification for creating this distortion, given that the repayments are actually now well ahead of schedule. The Minister needs to be reminded that the residual portion of work account is spread across businesses based on risk relativities that are actually now 10 years old in their calculations, sir. The identified problem is a large one. At current rates of collection, given a legislative stop date of 2019, the government will have over-collected $852 million from the work account, $155 million from the earners account, and $468 million from the motor vehicle account. I don't think anyone in this House would agree that this should be allowed to happen, and I acknowledge that that's why we're here today. But let's be very clear, there has been next to no time for this consultative process, and especially around the residual levy collection. It has been put to this House that the residual levies be discontinued by order in council, but New Zealand First wants to point out the reality of the government going down this path. If we do in fact, that's actually if we acknowledge that some of the debate tonight has been fair and relevant, because it is still in debate if in fact that this legislation is needed in the first place. But that's what consultation is about, and I acknowledge that from here we go to a consultative phase. New Zealand First disagrees in principles with these council structures and legislation. So I've stood up many times and spoken out against this method of consultation and interference with process with government entities, SOEs and the like. It gives too much power to the Minister and her chosen few. Give the Minister the power to make this decision, and unsurprisingly, it's been stated in the consultation that there are concerns around additional risks on transparency and certainty. Putting these calculations and dates into legislation now will actually achieve the goal as set out by this government, which New Zealand First does applaud. Continuing to collect residual levies given in legislation cannot be justified because it would be a disincentive to business who are working to lower their operational risks. But because the residual levy component is so high as a proportion of the total levy collected, sir, any discounts which businesses are entitled to are actually barely noticed when they do their job right. The discount they receive for having done their job right at the moment, because the residual levy is such a high proportion of the total levy counted, it takes away the incentive to make those changes. The incentives aren't there yet. So in bringing the residual collection date forward, we actually support and reward business for undertaking their businesses in a safe and professional manner. So making this change in legislation would be debated in the House, would be offered to a select committee round, and therefore implications would be made clear through the debate and submission process. Now, business needs certainty to operate, sir. So we need to be certain what it is that this government is hoping to achieve. And New Zealand First puts it to the Minister, to this government, that the best way to do that is actually by legislating the date now. Don't give the power to the Minister to act ad hoc. It's even noted that in doing so, that the timeline may in fact be pushed out. So, sir, we support this bill through to Select Committee. Let's have the debate. Let's see if this legislation is actually needed, and New Zealand First reserves the right to consider the opinion of businesses and New Zealanders from that point, sir. Thank you.